pretty.
We're going fighting now.
That's what I just said.
Okay, I think we're going to start in a few seconds. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Hawley. I'm the president of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. We've been around for almost 25 years here in Winnipeg. I'm going to say a few opening remarks. Again, we're going to, because there was a slight delay, there will be a pause between me, or maybe we go right to you, David, who will introduce Mr. Poilievre, our guest today. I want to recognize a lot of people who made this event happen in a record short time. This literally came together in under 2 weeks. And if you could just hold your applause. The superstar here, of course, is our board member, Ken Muse, and his brain... and his promotion team, Braden, Vahav, David, Jordan, Henry, and I'm sure there are a couple of more. We have lots of corporate sponsors, and in the interest of time, I will name the top three corporate sponsors. Parrish and Heimbecker, Reimer World Corp, and the Manitoba Real Estate Association. And these organizations, they sponsored student intern tables. If our student interns could just stand up for a second, please. Where are they? They're somewhere here. They're spread out, I guess. We have lots of MPs and politicians. In terms of MPs, we'll start off, and you can maybe just raise your arm. James Bazan, Selkirk Interlake, and the Shadow Minister of Defense. He's the longest serving MP in Manitoba. Dan Mazier, Dauphin Swan River. Ted Falk, Provencher. Larry McGuire, Brandon Souris. In terms of the MLAs, of course, Calvin Gertson, the 23rd Premier of Manitoba and the Minister of Justice. We have Audrey Gordon, Minister of Health. Andrew Smith, Minister of Sport, Culture and Heritage. Andrew Micklefield, Deputy Speaker, and he's from the Rosmere riding. James Tietzma from Radisson. Janice Morley-Lecomte, Seine River. Obi Khan, Fort White. And of course, the freshly minted Kevin Klein from Kirkfield Park. A few other introductions, of course, Lawrence Tate, my neighbor out in Cottage Country. He was at Elmwood Transcona at one time, I think, former. Stephen Fletcher, Charleswood. Oh yeah, there's Stephen. Former MP, Charlie Mayer, who was on the board of the Frontier for many years, and he was the Minister of Agriculture under Brian Mulrooney. Shola Agbula, past president of the Association of Black Conservatives. Devo Varma, president of the University of Manitoba Campus Conservatives. Unfortunately, he is ill, so he is not here today. Evan Robinson, president of the University of Winnipeg Campus Conservatives. And of course, Stephen Barber, National Counsel for the Conservative Party of Canada. Now, some of you have noticed I left out one of Manitoba's MPs, and I did that on purpose. Let's trace back things with articulate politicians, and often you can find some connection with a public policy think tank. Frontier is very proud of one former Frontier Centre intern, someone who made quite the splash on important public policy topics like Canada's extreme overreach on COVID and nonsense like Bill C-21, where we're confiscating rifles used by duck hunters and farmers to somehow combat gang handgun violence in Toronto. Raquel Dancho, where are you? Stand up, Raquel. Keep up the good work. On your table, you will find many reading materials, which brings us to the most famous Frontier alumni. And you may have seen this book around, and there are extra copies at the back if you would like one. It's written by David Seymour, and David Seymour was the Saskatchewan director of the Frontier Centre between 2007 and 2011. He wrote the book, Birth of a Boom, Saskatchewan's Coming Golden Age, which is on your table. And it is a gift to you from Frontier, and if you want, we have more in the back, just come and ask. This book is a big picture vision of our next door neighbor province, Saskatchewan. And for those of you who attended our last lunch on the Frontier with former Saskatchewan Premier Grant Devine, you will see that indeed that province is booming. Formerly the poor kid of Western Canada, its per capita income is now 30% higher than Manitoba's. David Seymour is today the second most powerful politician in New Zealand, and I predict he could be the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand later this year. Pretty good for a Frontier alumnus. He was part of the New Zealand policy mafia that is part of the DNA of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. If you look at the items on your table, you will have found this item here. It's a timeless wisdom by Sir Roger Douglas, The Politics of Successful Structural Reform. This item is the most important public policy commentary, in my view, that has ever been written. Sir Roger was the finance minister of the New Zealand Labour government between 1984 and 1988. Hey, we have this connection to left-wing governments at the Frontier Centre. He orchestrated enormous structural reform, cutting the public sector down by 60%, selling off crown corporations, and slashing income tax while bringing in a GST. These were the fastest and most consequential reforms done in the shortest time period of any government in history. Sir Roger, who's now 85, he's on our advisory board at Frontier. This article was written for the Wall Street Journal in 1990. And, obviously for our rock star guest today, we hope you can read this, Pierre, and maybe it will help you in your big project. You will next find this bookmarky thing. We call this a policy Slim Jim. And it's basically a roadmap for Manitoba. If you wanted Manitoba to have 3 million people and not be a have-not province, the ideas in here are, it will get you there, okay? It's all about good public policy. And as our friend Sir Roger observes, not much progress will happen if you run the place like the Bulgarian post office, okay? And this is all about excellent public policy. The other piece is very relevant to our speaker today, and you will see 57 policy proposals to help make the Canadian economy soar. You have a summary sheet of it, and you can go to our website and download the longer paper. It's 26 pages long. And we also have a few copies at the back. My favorites are, of the 57, number 13, which is returning the federal government to its size in 2015. 17, swapping the GST to the province as a replacement for equalization and federal transfers. And number 17, ending the ridiculous ban on plastic bags. Boy. I will end with some background on Frontier. We've been around 25 years. We are one of the most prolific think tanks in Canada. There have been 10,000 posts on the Frontier website if you look, and chances are that one or two might rub you the wrong way. But that's what think tanks are about. We're about ideas. We don't shy. We challenge false narratives. During its years, it has been a forum for big policy thinkers from all sides and parties. Our focus has been how to create high-performance government and high-performance cities. We can point you to best practices and discuss how we can learn from them and how they can make our politicians' jobs easier and deliver valuable services at much lower costs. Frontier is big on transformational change, and certainly we do need transformational change at all levels of government. We have featured speakers from all parts of the political spectrum, with a special emphasis on what we call the thinking left, okay? We started off, and you might remember some of these, we had the boss of the City of Indianapolis Union. That's the equivalent of the boss of CUPE speaking at Frontier. We've had Swedish health and education experts and reformers. The Stockholm healthcare model, where public and private health providers compete to deliver services in a single payer model. And in Sweden, they don't have school boards. They basically have vouchers, and the parents get funded and the schools must compete. Frontier has hosted politicians from all political parties, and I'll list them off for you. We've had a big Democrat, John Norquist from Milwaukee. We've had the former Prime Minister of Ireland, and we've also had Vladimir Putin's flat tax architect, Andrei Ilyanov, in the very early days. We have hosted Liberals, Senator Mac Harb, Finance Minister Paul Martin, Manitoba Liberal Party leader John Gerard, and of course, lots of NDP have talked to the Frontier Centre. We've had former Manitoba Premier Ed Schreier and Governor General Ed Schreier speak. We've had Janice McKinnon from the Saskatchewan NDP, and we also had people from the NDP on our board, Jack Messer, who was the president of SAS Power and Agriculture Minister under Alan Blakeney. And this might really shock you, but we've had Jim Harris from the Green Party talking to the Frontier Centre. So we have talked to the Green Party, and we've also had Bob Rae, who was at one time Ontario NDP Premier and then became a Liberal. So Frontier deals with very difficult narratives. Former Greenpeace founder Patrick Moore is a senior fellow. And despite the phony baloney discussion around climate, he will tell you that carbon dioxide is at historically low levels. It is not pollution, and we need more of it. In the critical space of Aboriginal policy, Frontier has led the way with path-breaking work on creating high-performance governments and First Nations. We used to award $50,000 prizes to high-performance reserves, and we actually featured a lot of hard-working chiefs who came and shared how they were making their communities better. A lot of them were thinking big, and hopefully we're going to see them partnering on big projects like the Nistanan Utility Corridor, which involves another tidewater port at Port Nelson on the Hudson Bay. Manitoba can become a gateway to the west, with green hydro flowing to Alberta and Saskatchewan and natural gas and resources going to world markets on the Hudson Bay tidewater. Stephen Harper's Transparency Act, which required the First Nations to post their financial accounts, that came from the Frontier Centre. And the great Indian activist Russell Means from South Dakota and Maori reformer Alan Duff, who wrote the book Once Were Warriors, they were prominent Frontier guests who both cringed at the backwards-looking, grievance-obsessed, woke state of Canada's First Nation politics. And that's as far as I will go on that topic. I will end by observing that the most successful and transformative politicians we have known, Margaret Thatcher, Roger Douglas, and even Donald Trump, had think tanks behind them. The chattering classes in the PR firms on power and politics, or the commentariat in the government-funded media, are not the place to get serious policy reform advice. I will end with a commercial. We do not accept any government funding at the Frontier Centre. We would like you, if possible, to get involved with freedom-loving think tanks if you are sick of the situation, the status quo in Canada. We agree that Canada could be the most prosperous and free place in the world. Let's celebrate our proud history, and we have our famous John A. Macdonald poster, which we will have some copies there, and it talks about peace, order, and high-performance government, and that's what Frontier is all about. So I think at that point we were going to wait for half an hour and eat, but we've all eaten. So I am going to introduce my colleague David Lease. David Lease is the Vice President of Engagement and Development at the Frontier Centre and has done a fantastic job on all sorts of things. Over to you, David. Thanks, Peter.
Welcome to the Frontier, and we are delighted that this room is sold out, over 500 guests. So, on behalf of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy, join with me in giving a warm welcome to all of you, and of course our special guest, the Honourable Pierre Poilievre. Anyways, I wish you had my view, because this room looks terrific. We should almost get a picture right here. It's amazing, all of you in this room, and I wish that you have had a terrific time networking with each other, because we know that there's fantastic leaders from wall to wall here in this beautiful room. Speaking of rooms, Winston Churchill once said that history is always made in a crowded room. And that history continues today in a crowded room. As Peter said, we have a long history of having all kinds of leaders across Canada and around the world to talk about good public policy. We do believe in the power of ideas, ideas that can change the world and make life better for all Canadians. And that's the spirit in which Frontier pursues its mission. It's about good research and education and good public policy. And yes, it is all about good leadership as well. We're passionate about freedom, and we're passionate about serving all Canadians because we love our nation. We're nonpartisan, and as Peter said, we do not accept any government funding. So let's talk about today. As Canada begins 2023, our nation is arguably one of the richest in the world. Canada is endowed with unmatched geography, resources, and people. At the same time, our nation faces many profound and urgent policy choices that will determine whether the future of Canada is bright or dim. So what are those choices? We encourage you to think about these critical questions for the sake of not only ourselves, but of future generations. Here to help us talk about our current state of affairs and share more about a vision for Canada is the leader of Canada's official opposition. Pierre Poilievre is a lifelong Conservative. And I'm just going to reference his biography here. And he is someone who is a champion of the free market. He's a fighter for people taking ownership of and responsibility for their own futures. Pierre served as a trusted senior cabinet minister in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government, and he has served as a member of Parliament for 7 terms. Pierre is running to be the Prime Minister of Canada. He believes in a country where the state is servant and not master, where smaller government makes room for bigger citizens, where people have the freedom to build a business without red tape and heavy tax. To make room for personal freedom and responsibility, he believes in limiting government. He has been one of the loudest voices in the past several years fighting out of control deficit spending and tax increases. As Liberals, Pierre was one of the first voices to highlight the inflation crisis that this country faces, pointing out that the sharp increases represent an inflation tax, a kind of backwards way of governments to raise money by raising prices for the people. Today, more than half of families in Canada say they struggle just to feed themselves. He also was one of the first voices to speak up against unscientific mandates and unacceptable limits on the freedoms of Canadians during the COVID-19 pandemic. Pierre believes that freedom is critical for this country and has pressed the government to commit to ending its politicized and divisive response. Pierre lives in Eastern Ontario village of Greeley with his wife Aneta and their children Valentina and baby Cruz. He grew up in Calgary and graduated from the University of Calgary with a degree in international relations. Please join with me in giving a warm Winnipeg and Manitoba welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back out here in God's country, out on the prairies, my home region. Thank you very much for that warm Manitoba welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I have my roots in this part of the country, and that's why it's always so good to come back. It wasn't hard to convince me. James was very clever in getting me the invitation, though. He called me up and he said, Pierre, do you believe in free speech? I said yes. He said, how would you like to give one? And, that's how I ended up here today. And of course, we have many of our other colleagues in the room, great conservative members of Parliament, federal and provincial, who are fighting on your behalf. My good friend Raquel Dancho. When I got here, she said, Pierre, you have to see Manitoba's seniors. And she took me to a wonderful seniors home. And I said, Raquel, are they really going to want to see some politician from Ottawa here in Manitoba? She said, oh, you're going to be a big star. So I walked up to a lady and I said, do you know who I am? She said, no, but if you ask the nurse, she'll tell you. So it's always good to be grounded. And you know, I'm grounded by my own roots, having grown up in Alberta. I was born to a 16-year-old unwed mother. Her mom had just died of a heart attack, so she wasn't able to raise me. She put me up for adoption to two school teachers. And they always taught me that it didn't matter where I came from, it mattered where I was going. It didn't matter who I knew, but what I could do. And that is the country I want my children to inherit. In fact, it's the same country that attracted my wife and her family here as refugees decades ago. Her father had worked in the banking sector in Venezuela, and they escaped and arrived in Montreal in a working class neighborhood, and he went from wearing a suit and working in a bank to jumping on the back of a pickup truck every morning to be driven out to a farm field and pick fruit every day, because he knew that there was no greater dignity than to sacrifice to feed one's family. And now he's a part owner in a pharmacy, and he owns rental properties, and is raising a second family in Toronto. And that is the country that he did inherit when he came here as an immigrant. But sadly, it's no longer the country that we see when we look around us today. Rather, we see a country where no matter how hard people work, they can't seem to get ahead. 40-year highs in inflation, the fastest rising food prices in a half a century, mean that 1.5 million people ate at a food bank in a single month in Canada last year. The Mississauga Food Bank CEO says she's getting visits from people asking her for help with medical assistance in dying, not because they're sick, but because they're so poor that they cannot bear to go on living in the misery that our economy has become for them. 35-year-olds live in their parents' basements, even though they did everything we asked them to do, got an education, got a job, worked hard, saved, sacrificed, but no longer can afford to buy a home. It's incredible here in Canada, where we have more land where there's no one than we have land where there's anyone. And we can't find a way to house our own people. They can't start families, build home equity, acquire collateral, or build a credit history, all the basic economic necessities of moving forward. And when people lose hope, the government cracks down with divisive name-calling and rhetoric and censorship to silence people who speak out. People are losing hope. We see despair in the tent cities that have popped up in formerly prosperous neighborhoods across this country. 30,000 Canadians over the last 7 years have died of opioid overdoses. And while our people, our brothers and sisters, lie face first on the pavement in the streets of Canada overdosing on these drugs, the very companies that profited and lied by bringing those drugs into our communities get juicy government contracts from Justin Trudeau's administration, having gotten off with total impunity. No, not everybody is doing badly. Those government contractors that have helped themselves to the $7 billion increase in contracting out that his government has provided, 70% increase in high-priced consultants. Those people are doing very well. The lobbyists whose registered activities have gone up 100%, the fastest growing industry in Canada is lobbying influence in government. They're doing very well. The Prime Minister, who forces the same suffering Canadians who can't feed themselves to pay taxes for his $6,000 a night stay in fancy London hotel rooms, he is doing just fine. Thank you very much. And meanwhile, he looks on at the problems that I've just described as though he's an observer, offering his opinion about why we can't get passports or air travel, or why our local drugstores don't have medication for our children. Ladies and gentlemen, if after 7 years he was not going to fix these problems, he will never fix them, and that is why we need to replace him with a new government that will work for the people. He will not fix these problems because he is the problem. Let's take inflation. Why do we have the fastest rising prices in over 40 years? Well, he'll blame it on anything but himself. He'll blame it on the war and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even though less than 2% of our trade is with those two countries, and the things that they produce are things we have right here at home: agricultural produce and energy. He'll blame it on COVID, even though economies have largely been open now for almost 2 years. He'll blame it on everyone but himself, but you know what? Bill Morneau disagrees with him. His own former finance minister says that the excessive government spending was one of the reasons why we have inflation today. Even the governor of the Bank of Canada has had an epiphany and realized that all that cash has driven up the cost of living. $500 billion of inflationary deficits, a bit up the cost of the goods we buy and the interest that we pay. Now, many of those dollars were necessary, but many weren't. 40% of new spending in the last 3 years had nothing to do with COVID. As I said earlier, there's been a 70% or $7 billion increase in contracting out. They paid CERB benefits to prisoners, to dead people, and to many people who had outright quit their jobs. They have not recovered any of those dollars. They paid wage subsidies to corporations that already had enough money to pay out dividends and bonuses to their executives. They paid $54 million for an ArriveCan app that we didn't need, didn't work, and could have been done for $300,000. The examples of waste and mismanagement in this government are too long to list in a single speech, but the Canadian people pay every single day for their high prices and their high costs. And furthermore, they want to raise them further. And this is going to be the biggest disagreement in the eventual election. Here it is. On the one hand, you have the NDP Liberal coalition, which wants to triple the carbon tax on the gas, the heat, and the food of our people, and the Conservative Party, which will axe the tax and fight climate change and protect the environment through technology and not taxation. It is not just enough to chronicle the suffering of the Canadian people, the fact that they feel like they've lost control of their lives. My purpose in running for office is to transform that hurt into hope, to give people back control of their lives in the freest country on earth. And here's how we're going to do it, my friends. Let's start with our money. A Poilievre government will bring in a dollar-for-dollar law, which will require politicians live by the same rules of scarcity as every other species in the universe. That is to say, if we bring in a new dollar of spending, we'll find a dollar of savings to pay for it, rather than just piling on more and more costs. You see, every other species, the birds and the trees, the fish and the seas, have to maximize the use of limited resources, not the politician. He just externalizes that scarcity by raising taxes, debt, or money printing. That will no longer go on. A Poilievre government will bring in a new law. In the States, they had it was called the Pay-As-You-Go law in the 1990s. And the result was that they balanced the budget for the first time in a half century, paid off $400 billion of debt. But as soon as the law lapsed, the American government went right back into deficit and has stayed there for the 2 decades that have followed, proving again that if politicians do not have legal limits on their spending, they will have an unlimited appetite for other people's money. The Canadian people have been pinching their pennies long enough. It's time the government started pinching its pennies too. And we will restore monetary policy in this country of a 2% inflation target. Over the last several years, our bank governor, under direct instructions of Justin Trudeau, decided he was going to play in fiscal policy. He printed $400 billion of new money, which caused the housing bubble to inflate and increase prices faster than at any time in 4 decades. My central bank governor will be independent from me and will have one simple instruction: keep inflation low, keep prices stable, and stay out of politics. That's how a central bank should function. We will cut wasteful spending. We'll avoid things like the ArriveCAN app. And we'll save hundreds of millions of dollars by cutting the waste and mismanagement at the CBC. And finally, instead of creating more cash, we've got to start creating more of what cash buys. Grow more food, build more houses, produce more energy right here in Canada. If you have an economy with 10 loaves of bread and $10, it's $1 for each loaf. If you double the number of dollars, you still have the same number of loaves of bread. Well, all of a sudden, each loaf goes up $2 a piece. But what if instead of just creating more cash, we bake more bread? We produce more output. We had 20 loaves of bread and $10, all of a sudden the price goes down to 50 cents. That's how you increase the purchasing power of our people. And that's what we're going to do when I'm Prime Minister. It starts by removing the government gatekeepers that stand in the way of our people. The government gatekeepers, yes. Let's start with our tax system. Today, if you are a $60,000 a year worker, a single mom with 3 kids, and you earn another dollar, you lose 80 cents of that dollar to clawbacks and taxes. So that works if you're earning $25 an hour, you're keeping $5 of that extra hourly wage. No one should be expected to work for $5 an hour. I was recently at a hotel in just near the airport in Toronto, and a waitress said that she went from earning $45K to $60K and didn't notice a difference because she was clawed back, she was taxed, and what was left was eaten up by inflation. We've created a system where hard work no longer pays off, where the aspirational person who puts in that extra hour, earns that extra bonus, feels like they're getting nowhere. Meanwhile, the cost of living continually rises. So a Poilievre government will appoint a task force to advise within 100 days on how we can cut and reform our taxes so that it always pays more to work more, so that the aspiring working class person can climb that ladder of opportunity and get ahead through their own hard work here in this country again. And we're going to ensure that they have big, powerful paychecks in the first place. And that means repealing anti-energy and anti-resource laws, including C-69, and replacing them with new laws that ensure we protect the environment, consult First Nations, but get things built right here in Canada for a change. Let's start with energy. We have we have beneath our feet 1,300 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and yet we do not export a single solitary cubic foot of that gas overseas. It either goes south of the border or it stays right here in Canada. Meanwhile, Japan this week and Germany a few months ago were begging us for our energy. Now, we could be exporting it. We had 15 different natural gas export terminals that were proposed when Justin Trudeau took office. Not a single one of them has been completed. Meanwhile, the Europeans are forced to fund Vladimir Putin's war because they have to buy his gas just to keep the heat on. We could replace his supply easily if we could liquefy the gas, and we have massive advantages in doing just that. We're the closest shipping distance to both Asia and Europe from North America. We have clean hydroelectricity to power the liquefaction plants, which means we can liquefy it at the lowest carbon emission on planet Earth. And finally, how do you turn a gas into a liquid? To put it on a ship. You cool it down. And what do we have in Canada? We have, especially here, cold weather, right? It's 25% cheaper to cool gas into liquid here in Canada than it is in the US Gulf Coast. In fact, it got so cold in Ottawa this winter, Justin Trudeau was actually seen with his hands in his own pockets. So we're going to clear away the red tape and the regulation. We're going to allow LNG Newfoundland and Labrador to go ahead. We're going to allow LNG projects to build in provinces like New Brunswick, and if they're interested, even in Quebec, where they have major opportunities. We're going to unleash the production and liquefaction of natural gas in British Columbia. I was recently in BC, and I spoke to a Hesla First Nations grandmother, their community is actually welcoming a massive natural gas project. If it gets approved by the federal government, it will mean billions of dollars of opportunity for her people. But for her, it wasn't about abstract concepts like that. For her, it meant that there would be money generated in her own community so that children like her autistic grandson would have access to the care that the federal government has promised those communities for decades and centuries and never delivered. It means independence and opportunity and self-determination for our First Nations people. And not, yes, absolutely, you can applaud that. And not only will we clear away the obstacles for First Nations to develop their resources, we will reform the fiscal relationship so First Nations keep more of their own source revenue rather than having to send it off to the patronizing bureaucracy in Ottawa and beg for it back. We want to put First Nations back in charge of their lives and get the bureaucracy and the colonialist central government out of the way so that they can take control of their futures and their destinies. It's not just natural gas. Of course, we have the third biggest supply of oil on planet Earth, and yet we're importing 130,000 barrels of the stuff from overseas to fund foreign dictatorships and send our money abroad. I will remove the anti-energy approach of this government so that we can produce more of our energy, build more of our pipelines, and I believe that we should ship our Canadian natural resources through the Port of Churchill, not just for the benefit of our resource sector, but for the benefit of all Manitobans as well. We will produce the minerals of electrification. You know, the Liberals love to talk about electric cars. They want everyone buzzing around in an electric car. Only problem is they have to burn coal in China to refine the lithium that goes into those batteries, which kind of defeats the purpose of the electric car, doesn't it? We have lithium here in Canada, but in 2020, we did not mine a single tablespoon of the stuff. Why? Because it takes forever to get a mine approved. There's even a government website where they have a discussion paper on this, and they admit that in Canada it can take as long as 25 years to get a mine approved. But why would an investor mine our resources 25 years from now when they can mine resources elsewhere in the next 25 months? The reality is we are becoming hopelessly dependent on China and other countries because we cannot approve the mining and manufacturing opportunities right here in Canada. Do you know that we rank 64th in the world for the time it takes to get a building permit? That means 63 other countries get those permits faster than we do. Well, that will end. When I'm Prime Minister, we will streamline the process for mining. We will produce the minerals of electrification right here in Canada. We will become a self-sufficient nation. We will harvest all of the resources that we've been blessed with, and we will generate massive and inflation-proof paychecks for our working class people so that they can have the opportunity, so that we can be a self-sufficient nation, so that we bow down before no foreign power to supply ourselves with the needs of our economy. And we will remove the same gatekeepers that keep our people poor here at home. The number one, our friends on the left love to talk about wealth inequality, but their policies are the number one driver of wealth inequality, of course, because what drives wealth inequality? Unaffordable real estate. If someone, a working class kid, gets out of school and can't afford a house, he will never be able to have the chance to build the equity upon which an economic life is built. You cannot live independently if you can't get a credit rating. You can't build home equity. You can't acquire collateral to eventually get a small business loan. New immigrants to this country are especially hurt because they come here without property and therefore are unable to join the true property-owning democracy that we have benefited from here in Canada for so long. When Justin Trudeau took office, the average house price was about $450,000. It hit more than double that. And now we're in the worst possible combination of events. The prices of the houses are going down, but the monthly payments needed to buy them are going up. So both the seller and the buyer are losing as a result. There is no excuse for this. There is no demographic or geographic explanation for any of it. We have more land and fewer people than any country in the G7. And yet we have the highest house prices of all of those countries. How is it possible that our real estate is more unaffordable than Singapore, an island, overpopulated? How is it possible that only New Zealand has more unaffordable real estate anywhere on planet Earth? Well, I'll tell you how. It's very simple. Government gatekeepers stand in the way. Woke, progressive, left-wing municipal governments who love to crow about equality go ahead and shut immigrants and working class people out of the housing market by preventing construction from happening in the first place. In Vancouver, the left coast, Vancouver, the cost of government in every single unit of housing is $650,000 for one unit of housing. What does this mean? I was in Vancouver. I said to my staff, find me the most outrageously overpriced house anywhere in the province. They found me this $5 million rotting shack falling apart. And so I went there, and we called the realtor, whose name was on the sign. And we said, explain this. She said, well, don't worry, you can tear it down and build 6 units on the spot. And I thought to myself, okay, well, let's do the math. $5 million for the land, just for the dirt. So divide that by 6, $900,000 in land costs alone for each one of these units that will eventually be built there. Let's say another $900,000 for each one of them in labor, materials, and of course government paperwork to get everything approved. That's $1.8 million for each one of those units. Now think about this for a second. That little shack would have been the slice of paradise for a barber and a waitress who would have been married 50 years ago when that place was built. They could afford that entire piece of land all by themselves. And now, a half century later, there is no way that any barber or any waitress or any middle-class person could even own one of those $1.8 million units. How is it possible that in a country where we're supposed to be getting better off, where each generation is supposed to have more opportunity than the one that came before it, that actually you can divide the same house that was affordable to the middle class a half century ago by 6, and those 6 families can't afford it? We are moving backwards because of the policies of gatekeeping left-wing governments. Well, that's not going to happen anymore, because here's my policy for them. Big city mayors who want infrastructure money are going to have to get out of the way, lower the cost, and improve the speed of building permits. I will link the number of dollars cities get for infrastructure to the number of houses that actually get built. They will be required they will be required to approve high-density housing around every federally funded transit station. And I will sell off 15% of all federal buildings and convert those into housing. And you know something? Yes, thank you. It just warms my heart to think of a beautiful family pulling up in their U-Haul to move into the wonderful new home that they will have in the former headquarters of the CBC. And we will remove the gatekeepers that stand in the way of our brilliant immigrants. Here we are, with our hospital system overflowing. It makes my blood boil when I bring my daughter in for a migraine at the emergency room in an Ottawa hospital, and she waits 5 hours when we know that there are hundreds of immigrant doctors that could be treating her but that are banned because of occupational licensing bodies that deny them the license to practice, even when they are qualified. These are the same woke licensing bodies that like to silence opinions that they disagree with, but have no problem discriminating against skilled immigrants whose skills we desperately need in our system. You know that Stats Canada recently published data showing that only 42% of immigrant doctors and only 36% of immigrant nurses actually work in the medical system in their jobs. Because even though they are qualified, they can't get the license. The most outrageous story came from the Aviation Association, which testified at the industry committee that they had a mechanic working on Air Canada planes in Munich, a German, fixing the planes when they stopped down in Europe for 20 years. Never did any of the planes he fixed up fall out of the sky. So he thought, well, I'll move to Canada and just keep working for the same company, Air Canada. He got here and he couldn't get a license to do the same job he'd been doing for 2 decades before. This is insane. We've got to crack down on these gatekeepers. So I'm going to team up with the provinces to set new goals. And the goals will be this, that within 60 days of an immigrant applying to work in their profession, they should get a yes or no based on their tested abilities, not based on where they come from. We will back up 30, yes. We will back up 30,000 small study loans so that those immigrants who are almost qualified but not quite can take time off work, skill up to the Canadian standard, and get licensed to practice. We will work with national umbrella organizations to make it possible for future immigrants to begin working on their credentials before they even arrive, so that when they set foot on Canadian soil, they can get busy working in that profession for which they are in such demand. In other words, we'll remove the gatekeepers, unleash opportunity for our brilliant immigrants so that we can have more doctors, more nurses, more architects, more inflation-proof paychecks for the hardworking newcomers who join us and join the Canadian family. That's our vision. In other words, my purpose in politics is bigger citizens through smaller government, more freedom through a smaller state, the freedom to work hard and share the fruits of your labor with your family, the freedom to build a business, to build a home, to buy a home, the freedom to raise your children with your own values and worship God in your own way. As a great Prairie Prime Minister once said, I'm speaking now of John Diefenbaker, I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to worship God in my own way, free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and for all of mankind. Thank you very much.
Well, look, I'm sure I can speak for everyone. You seem to have cast a very positive, aspiring vision, Mr. Poilievre. And so we're very glad that you've been gracious enough to accept a moment for some questions. And so the question I'd like to ask is a little bit about yourself as a leader. And we know that politics is not an easy role. What are some of the key values that guide you as a leader?
I guess everything for me flows from the idea that I have a very consistent idea of human nature. I think that humanity has all the same vices and virtues, regardless of a person's station in life. You see, our political adversaries on the left, they believe that human nature is transformed, that when people take power in government, they all of a sudden become angels and geniuses who are capable of judging and deciding for everybody else. I happen to believe that leaders have the same virtues and vices as the people they lead. And that if you think that man is too flawed to govern himself, then how can you possibly believe he can govern others, right? So I believe in the power of the common person to decide for him or herself, the common man and the common woman. And that is the basic principle on which our system is based. For centuries we had this divine right of kings and queens to decide for the people, but over time, over hundreds of years, from starting with the Magna Carta in 1215, we believed that the commoners should be in charge. They should make the decisions, and that the crown should ultimately be servant. That's why we have a House of Commons, a house of the common people. You can't spend a single dollar in government without having the common people vote to approve it. And so what we have now, though, is a kind of a new aristocracy where the Trudeau government and those who support it, and similar left-wing governments around the world, who will be meeting in Davos this week, believe that they know better, that they have some sort of divine ability to decide for everyone else. And there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that is true. I believe in the common sense of the common people. You know, of all the great soaring rhetoric we heard from Winston Churchill in the Second World War, my very favorite story about him during that time was when he would go out into the streets of London and that had just been destroyed by the air raids. And he and his team stumbled upon a lady who was trapped under rubble. She was an old lady who'd been out shopping, and her shopping bags were right beside her. And so they all knelt down with the rescue team and they lifted away the rubble. And as soon as it was off her, she jumped to her feet. She was a little old lady, and she grabbed her bags and she said, "I'm sorry, Prime Minister, I have no time to talk. I've got things to do." And she walked off. And Winston Churchill said something there. He said, "There goes greatness. There goes greatness." Something he never said about other foreign leaders or heads of state. He saw greatness in that common person who dusted herself off, picked herself up, got back to work, did the nation's duty. Those are the real heroes. Those are the people that I champion. I'm not running for office to take power. I'm running for office to give it back to the common people. Thank you.
So just further to that question, can you tell us more about your motivation to serve in this role? What would you say motivates you to serve in the demanding role of Leader of the Opposition and possibly serve as our nation's next Prime Minister?
Well, Leader of the Opposition, principal job, and that, the political establishment hates to hear this, but the principal job of Leader of the Opposition is to prosecute the government. And that's by design. My critics in the Canadian political establishment, they want me to stop pointing out the problems with this government. They like conservative leaders who just show up and maybe have the odd little procedural disagreement, but by and large just accept the direction of the Laurentian elite and the established liberal orthodoxy. That is not how our system was designed. Our system was deliberately designed to make the most powerful people tremble when they walk into the House of Commons, right? To make the mighty low. That's the purpose of the system. It is to render the leaders of the land modest and humble every single day. Every time they think of doing something that would harm their people, they're deterred by the fact that all will be made known and all accountability will be upheld on the floor of the House of Commons. And the job of the official opposition, and they call it His Majesty's loyal opposition, which might seem paradoxical, that opposition and loyal are in the same sentence. It is designed that way. It is meant to be that way. Because by providing an opposition to the government for its bad behavior and its poor decisions, we are being loyal to the Crown and the common people. And that is the purpose of a leader of the opposition. Now, that only gets you to the start of the election campaign. At that point, you have to present yourself as the Prime Minister in waiting and provide an alternative vision so that people know not just what they're voting against, but what they are voting for. And that is exactly what we will do. We will present a vision that puts Canadians back in charge of their lives, that transforms the hurt into hope, that makes it possible for young people to afford homes, for paychecks to grow, for inflation to be tackled, for streets to be safe. All of those things will be possible, and we will do them. And my plan to bring those policies home will be clear as day when Canadians go in to cast their ballot. Thank you.
So, Mr. Poilievre, you've spoken quite a bit today and in the past about the economy. And the facts are that there are, as you cited, record levels of inflation, both personal, wholesale levels, record deficits and record levels of debt, as we've really never seen before as a country. And that debt level is in both government, but also personal. And we have remarkably low productivity numbers and low business investment in our country. And on top of this, more and more taxes, to name just a few of the major issues that we face in the economy. And our job growth is largely coming from the growth of the public sector, not the private sector, we know. Meanwhile, we have a class of bureaucrats and politicians that believe, quite frankly, in the perverse modern monetary theory of the world. The deficits really don't matter, or money, frankly, grows on trees. It's part of a well-known pattern that we've seen at Frontier, a pattern where public policy, in public policy world, where prolific politicians damage our economy with out-of-control spending, and then that leads to massive borrowing and in turn higher taxes. This is like a vicious cycle, and that inevitably leads to a fiscal crisis, sharp declines to growth, and of course falling currency values and living standards. This is all in plain view. Now, when we look at the international scope, we see Venezuela and Argentina, and this kind of pattern has been well articulated. Mr. Peter Hawley's mentioned this. One of our heroes is Sir Roger Douglas, who is the Labour Minister of Finance in New Zealand in the 1980s when New Zealand was about to hit the wall. He led a massive structural reform effort to right-size government and empower the people, and frankly get rid of the privilege of so many special interests. So the question is this: is there an easy way to summarize why this great country, Canada, despite being such a rich nation, is in such a vulnerable state? Do you believe we're at a tipping point as we look at a possible downward spiral?
There is a tipping point. It is coming. I don't know if we're there yet. I can give you some of the basic facts, though. Canada has about $9 trillion of personal, corporate, and government debt combined. We have about $1.85 in household debt for every dollar of disposable household income. That is a record. Household debt now exceeds $2 trillion, which means we have more debt, household debt, than we have GDP. The same is true of corporations, who have another $2 trillion of debt. And then you have $2 trillion of government debt, which adds up now to $6 billion, and then if you include the debt that's in the financial system, that's how you get to your $9 billion. That means we have about $3.50 of debt for every dollar of GDP. To put that into perspective, that is by far a record. There's never been a time in recorded economic history that we've had this much debt relative to our income. The last time we had a major financial meltdown in Canada, homemade, was under the first Trudeau. We had, of course, interest rates that had to go up to 20%. At that time, though, we had a lot less debt. Our households were much less indebted, and our businesses were as well. So we only had about a 200% debt to GDP ratio across the entire economy. Now it's 3.5, almost 4. So we have vastly more debt now than we had then, but we have more moderate interest rates that are unfortunately rising very quickly. The question is whether or not we can lift our income as a nation, or our households can lift their incomes as families before interest rates make their debt payments unsustainable. Now, already rates are up 4 points in less than a year. It's hard to believe, but at the beginning of 2022, we were at 0.25% as the bank policy rate. Every single month, something like 100,000 people have to renew their mortgages at the new rates. And if you think someone's got a $400,000 mortgage and they're paying even 2% more than they were when they locked in 2018, that's $8,000 a year. That's a lot of money in after-tax terms for a middle-class family. How many families will then either have to sell their homes, have to drastically reduce their living standards, or have to declare bankruptcy? I suspect that there will be a lot. Now the question is how quickly. I think it will be gradual, and it will get worse and worse over the next several years. What can the government do about it at this point? Well, one, we have to reduce the pressure on the cost of living and interest rates. That means reducing the cost of government. Government is driving up inflation. These inflationary deficits, by the agreement of the Bank of Canada now, by the way. This is not just a conservative idea. Everybody now agrees, except for the government itself, that these inflationary deficits are driving up the cost of living and, by extension, driving up interest rates. So the biggest threat to household finances is the fact that governments are hitting people with new and higher costs. We have to cap government spending and unleash the productive forces of our economy so that we can make more, spend less with paychecks and not debt. Thank you.
So just to pick up on the theme of inflation, what are you hearing from people as you listen to so many Canadians? We know that inflation is impacting all Canadians.
Well, I mean, I could tell you all the stories that you're all hearing yourselves. I mean, inflation is theft. It is taxation without representation, because it's caused by government money printing, but it's never voted on in the House of Commons. So if you wanted to raise the sales tax, you'd have to hold a vote. But the governments can raise the sales tax every single year by imposing inflation. It's basically the same thing. You pay for it every time you buy stuff, and no one voted for it in the House of Commons. But they do it by printing and creating cash, and then the poorest people suffer the most because, one, consumption is a bigger part of their household budget than it is for richer people, and two, because the very rich shield themselves from inflation by owning assets that go up with inflation. If you can buy gold and precious metals or real estate or stocks or other things that rise as the inflation rate goes up, then you're protected from inflation. But of course the have-nots can't actually buy any of those things because they don't have anything to buy it with. So it is a massive wealth transfer from the have-nots to the have-yachts. And it is unjust and unfair, and that's why we need a government that will reverse the inflationary policies, bring back hard money, and protect the purchasing power of the working people.
Okay. My last question relates to the area of justice. We know the rule of law is foundational to our society, the practice that everyone, regardless of who they are, They're equal before the law, and the law is based on evidence, not speculation. We can never have a two-tiered justice system. So part of this is foundational to our Western civilization, and I want to talk a little bit about justice in the area of the judiciary, namely judges. We seem to be seeing a pattern where some judges seem to think that they're elected. And the issues are complex, but time and again, there appears to be a clear pattern of broad and frankly inappropriate judicial activism. And they're making the law even de facto new charter rights. So I want to just quickly summarize some of those things that we're seeing. We see the green lighting, what is now, frankly, the world's least regulated regime for assisted suicide. We see the slashing of gun sentencing laws, so it's difficult to keep offenders in jail. We see that the Supreme Court even decided that it's cruel and unusual punishment to keep mass killers in jail for life. We see also almost a black comedy about the whole question of taking beer across a provincial border. We think of the case of the fellow going across New Brunswick into Quebec to get some beer. So now, absurdly, it's unconstitutional to do that. Namely, he's paying a fine, but it's unconstitutional because you are allowed to have free trade, and yet he's still going to pay a fine. So these decisions have major consequences and harm to Canadians, and we know these examples, including the murder of so many innocent people tragically on a Saskatchewan reserve, and a number of police officers, to name just a few.
Right.
We hear the cries of pain and outrage. What should we be doing to get people back into their policy lane?
Well, the first thing I would point out is that most of the examples, the outrages that you just listed, are actually not imposed by judges. These are the policies of the Trudeau government. Let's go through them. One exception, the decision by the Supreme Court to remove consecutive sentencing for multiple murderers. So if you kill 3 people, you're only going to face sentences for 1 murder. That was imposed by the Supreme Court. That was wrong, and I have said that I would reverse that decision with the use of the notwithstanding clause to keep mass murderers behind bars for the rest of their lives. When it comes to moving alcohol across borders, it is true the court ruled that it was not unconstitutional for provinces to restrict free trade of liquor. But those are policies by the provincial governments themselves and not imposed by, they were allowed by the court, but not imposed by the court. Almost everything else you listed, though, are policies of the Trudeau government. It is Justin Trudeau's policy to reduce penalties for violent gun criminals. It is Justin Trudeau's policy to allow medical assistance in dying, and actually the state to administer medical assistance in dying for people who are mentally ill and for teenagers. That is his policy. So let's not distract ourselves by blaming judges for policies that the Prime Minister himself is imposing. He's the one that's doing these things, and we should prosecute him. And when I'm Prime Minister, we will no longer treat depression with medical assistance in dying. We will give people hope and opportunity to turn their lives around, and we will ensure that there's medical care for people who are suffering from mental illness so that they can have a better life in this country. And I will appoint judges who will interpret the law and ensure that the charter rights of Canadians, including freedom of expression, are honored right across this country. Thank you.
Thank you. We're just near the end of our program, so on that note, I want to call forward Ken Muse, who's the director for the Frontier Centre for Public Policy, to thank Mr. Poilievre.
So on behalf of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy, and in fact, on behalf of all the friendly Manitobans in this room, thank you for visiting us and making the time for us in little old Winnipeg. I know the pundits say that you have to be in the GTA and spend all your time in the 905. So thank you, we appreciate you being here. And being a prairie boy and one of us, I know that you don't take us for granted. So thank you. And we put this lunch together in less than 2 weeks, and it sold out with over 500 people. Thank you. So you're basically a rock star, Mr. Poilievre. And I think if we had another week, we would have sold at least 1,000. So the tickets sold fast, and you were the hottest ticket in town. The only thing that was hotter was Prince Harry's memoir. So yeah. And I think if the turnout today is any indication, whatever your political stripe, it's hard not to conclude, sir, that we have before us today the next Prime Minister of Canada. Thank you. Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay, I would like to wrap that up, and thank you very much, Ken. As we bring this exciting event to a close, please join with me again and I want to do a couple quick thank yous and a special announcement. First of all, I want to reiterate our thank you to our sponsors, the Manitoba Real Estate Association, David Salvatore, the Parish and Heimbecker, John Heimbecker is here, Reimer World Corporation, and thank you, Dr. Don Reimer. We have many partners that help make this event possible, including the Association of Black Conservatives,